Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 56 of the Liberator podcast. I'm here with the whole crew today. Sam's back from California. We got Russell, and we have a very special guest who we have been teasing you guys with for weeks and weeks because we're all busy. And our guest today has 10 kids, a full-time job as a lawyer, and is the director of 2 abolitionist organizations. And so we've been teasing this one forever, and we are very, very excited that today we have with us the abolitionist attorney, Bradley Pierce. Bradley, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be with you guys.
The abolitionist attorney.
Yeah. Maybe one day we'll have 2. You know, Alex Eades will graduate law school or something. We'll have 2. But for now, Bradley is the abolitionist attorney.
It's like in the medieval period, there was the philosopher, the theologian, the abolitionist attorney.
Yeah.
But the father of 10 kids. Whew, how you feeling?
Very blessed. Very blessed. More than I deserve.
Great answer.
Yep.
Well, yes, we are very stoked to have you on today to talk about serious things, but we could probably do a whole episode on what it's like being a full-time attorney with 10 kids, but future episode.
Yeah. So many of the people who watch our show will already be familiar with you, Bradley, and your work. But for those who aren't, just tell us a little bit about what you're doing for the cause of abolition, the cause of Christ, and just about yourself in general.
Yeah, so I'm an attorney. I've been practicing for 14 years. I'm based here in Texas. Grew up here in Texas. My husband and my wonderful wife, Cindy, and we're expecting number 10 is on the way right now. And so we're very, very blessed. That's one of the greatest blessings I've ever had. And another great blessing is just to get to serve as executive director of Abolish Abortion Texas. We've been operating for 5 years, fighting for abolition here in Texas, and have had several bills, and we've been grateful for that. And then we also have an organization we started about 1.5 years ago called the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, just a place to kind of park work that we were already doing, and that is drafting bills of abolition for other states and doing presentations and education on the subject of abolition. So we now do that under the Foundation to Abolish Abortion.
Awesome. So before we get into the actual content of the brief itself, for people who may not know, Amicus Brief, or what the meaning of the Latin is there, or just what it means in general, talk about what an Amicus Brief is, and then about the purpose of this particular Amicus Brief.
Sure. Well, first of all, I like how you pronounce amicus there. That's how we pronounce it here in Texas as well.
Amicus.
But I've been pronouncing it amicus lately because in a lot of states, that's how they pronounce it. And at the Supreme Court, that's how they pronounce it.
Yeah, the hoity-toity say amicus.
That's right, yes. And I did take a couple semesters of Latin, and I think amicus is a little more correct than amicus. But amicus sounds a lot better. So
It does.
I'll probably go back and forth here. So an amicus brief, it's the full term is Amicus Curiae Brief, and it's Latin. It means friend of the court. And so when you submit a brief to a court, amicus brief, you are coming not as a party to the case, right? You're not one of the litigants. You're not the plaintiff. You're not the defendant. You're not the petitioner. You're not the respondent. You're just someone on the outside of the case, on the outside looking in. But you feel like, or you think that you have a perspective that the court would benefit from hearing. And so you come as a friend of the court to submit a brief, to make additional arguments in addition to those that are already being made, and hopefully add something to the discussion. So that's what an amicus brief is.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, what I like about this one, one of the really awesome things about this is as far as all of us are aware, and I think as you've said, as far as you're aware, this is the first time that an abolitionist amicus brief has been filed before the Supreme Court. Like in every abortion-related case, of course, there's the Americans United for Life and National Right to Life, and all those organizations are kind of putting forth, the pro-life perspective. Yeah. Kind of just asking the Supreme Court, hey, this is a very moderate thing. Will you just let us do this very moderate, kind of common sense thing? And that's been the perspective the court has heard for every case for the last 48 years. Yeah. But now it's like, no, it's like the abolitionist, and as we'll get into, this is very different from what those groups have been typically submitting before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so I think this one's actually different on a number of levels. I mean, I haven't read just a ton of briefs before, but all the ones that I've read have usually been kind of in that vein. Like,
yeah,
there's this case before you. We really do think that this is good and you should do this and it's constitutional, yada, yada, yada. But just in your explanation of the friend of the court thing, I like how you actually open up the document kind of like with I would say it's kind of a rhetorical, it's a reasonable appeal, but it's got a lot of strong rhetorical value. Opens up and say like, hey, we're being your friend here.
Yeah.
We are coming before you, kind of appealing to you, and the fact that the Supreme Court isn't all that respected right now. And whenever you make rulings that are unconstitutional and just unjust and unlawful, people tend to think less well of you. And so we are coming to you truly, like you say, in light of these consideration, we come as true friends of the courts as a constitutional institution. So it's like weird. It's like reading it. I feel like you're dealing with some of the loftiest people in the country, some of the hoity-toityest of them all. And you're like reminding them, hey, here, your authority comes from ultimately God, and you are a constitutional institution, and you all this kind of stuff. And as a friend, your legitimacy is kind of on the line here. And I don't think I've ever read any brief that sort of like comes at it from that kind of an angle. Certainly not at that kind of an angle where I think the readers of the brief are going to be kind of like sitting there thinking, is what this guy's saying true? Like if we make the wrong ruling here, are we losing respect? So I mean, I love that. Like the first time whenever you emailed it back then, I was like, wow, he's being that kind of friend that sometimes we don't want. You know, it's like, let me remind you of who you are and what's at stake. So,
yeah, and
really
so
appreciate
what
that.
You just touched on was section 1 of the brief. So real quick, I'll just give an overview of the 3 parts of the brief, and then we'll kind of let you kind of tee you off to talk about each one, Bradley. So the brief has 3 parts. Part 1, Roe v. Wade and refusal to overturn it undermines the legitimacy and authority of the court. Part 2, where the court does not restrain its authority within its legitimate bounds, the court impels those faithful to the Constitution to seek redress via other constitutional avenues. Part 3, in addition to overruling Roe, the court should recognize that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires that state laws protecting born persons against homicide may not deny equal protection to persons not yet born. So that's kind of the structure of the brief. And so with that, just kind of talk about what Russell was talking about, part 1 there, how the refusal to overturn Roe actually undermines the court itself.
Sure. Yeah. Before I get into that, just real fast, I just want to say this was one of the hardest things I've ever had to write. Doesn't follow your normal legal briefs, which are kind of issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, where you're just examining it in light of that. In this case, I'm really arguing about the role of the court itself, which I'm almost never, in fact, I've never done in any other legal brief I've written, as far as their role as a constitutional institution, and talking about that, and then bringing scripture to bear, because I think this is a role of not just this brief is not just about the law, even about the highest law, the highest earthly law, and that is the Constitution, but it's also about God's law. And I'm even coming as all Christians should be, not as some special prophet, right, sent by God in a special way, but as a prophet, as all Christians should be prophets. And so that's how I'm coming to the court in that way, and bringing God's word. So it's certainly a very different thing than anything I've ever written, but it's also something I really enjoyed more than anything else I've ever written as well.
Yeah. There's a section here that I really liked. I'd just like to read it just to, again, highlight the fact that this is not a typical, either pro-life brief or like any brief I've ever seen. So you write on page 9, you say, the ultimate source of all legitimate earthly authority is divine. It is derived from our Lord Jesus Christ, who has been delegated it by God the Father. As Christ said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. As a result, we, the people of the United States, only have so much authority as Christ has delegated to us. Regarding the power of the court, it only has so much authority and over such matters as delegated to it by the people through the states in the Constitution. Even to that extent, it only has so much authority and over such matters as the people have been delegated by God. And so I love the hierarchy of authority that you set up there. So God is the ultimate standard. He is the ultimate authority. And then in the American system, we've got the people who are next underneath God and the Constitution, the people in the Constitution. And then underneath that, you have the court. And I just love how you put things in the right perspective, because that's not something that even most like conservative lawyers, like probably a lot of people who you went to school with or think of conservatives, they wouldn't even say things like that. Yeah. This is like the Christian position that needs to be, as you said, heralded. Like this is the Word of God. This is the Constitution.
It's the sort of thing that people may say in like speeches, or like in popular books, or like at rallies and stuff, but it rarely finds it into like the official law and policy stuff that they're doing.
Yeah.
And so just the idea that there would be, and I appreciate that you call it sort of prophecy, like that it's a prophetic word that you are bringing to the Supreme Court of the United States on behalf of the truth, and so it's not something that they normally read, and it thrills me to no end that there's all these like, law clerks and, assistants and so on and so forth that just have to sit here and read this. Journalists, they have to read it. And most of them, I'm sure, are in some level scoffing at it. And like, sort of like, this person believes these antiquated blah, blah, blah. Or they look at it and they go, this is the sort of thing that people usually say for political reasons, but leave out of this sort of thing. Like this guy's serious. He's really telling us this.
Yeah.
And so, and that it's truth, that it's biblical, I think that it's not going to return void, that it's going to have that effect. Even on people who deny it, they're going to look at it and be like, oh, I'm being reminded of this, whether they agree with it or deny it or not. That's what a prophetic rebuke is. That's what a prophetic word is. That's stand before God as having heard this in the flesh. And so,
and that's, that's something that I kept thinking of while I was writing it. I was actually thinking, what, I'm going to get laughed at. I mean, there will be, people in the legal community, who are going to read this and laugh at it.
Yeah.
I mean, one time I was at the Texas legislature, and a legislator there was talking about a one-pager document that we had kind of breaking down the abolition bill there. And he said he was not laughing, but he said, I mean, there are people in this building laughing because you use scripture in your one-pager here. And
he probably doesn't just mean the Democrats. He probably means there were some even Republicans who were laughing.
Yeah, the Republicans, I think, even.
Yeah.
I think what I thought of whenever he said that was Psalm 2, and that is when the kings and the rulers and the judges take counsel against God, he laughs at them.
Yep.
And
that's good.
So I'd much rather have people laughing at me than God laughing at me.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as the, getting back to the point that James was just reading about there, I believe from Scripture. I mean, as the brief says, all authority is derivative, right? It comes from an ultimate source, and the ultimate source is divine. It's God, and I believe it comes kind of through two different ways. One of which is through the people, right? Priesthood of believers. The God delegates the authority directly to us. Then we delegate some to, by the consent of the governed to secure our rights. We then institute governments, and we delegate authority to the government through the Constitution, and then through the Constitution to the court. But then I believe that it also comes directly from God. Just like I said in the brief, like Jesus said to Pilate, that you would have no authority unless it had been given to you from above. Yep. Now, the authority came through Caesar in different ways, but I believe the authority comes both through the people, then the states, then the Constitution, then the court. But it also, the court owes a duty directly to God in addition to the duty that it owes through the people.
Yeah. One other part from part one here that I wanted to highlight, again, just to kind of talk about how different this is. You're actually, I mean, it's literally a call to repentance. So on page 10 and 11, you write, therefore, whether this court chooses to acknowledge this truth or not, the truth that its authority that comes from God, It and other civil officials and institutions have been given authority and associated responsibility by God to act as his ministers of justice. Amici therefore call upon the court to submit itself to God and administer justice in this matter. And so, I mean, this is it's law, but it's also like a sermon. This is like a presentation of a call to repentance, and it's just really, really impressive to read.
And a very high view of people like the magistrates and their role, the justices and their role, like they've actually lowered it in the way that they've got it. I don't think they wake up in the morning and think I'm a minister of God's justice. Right. They don't believe in that, and they've thrown all that out, and they think of themselves very highly. But this is serious stuff. I mean, it's like they're doing the will of God in the earth that they're supposed to be, and when they don't do that, that's serious. And so again, I mean that they are being reminded of that. And of course, I guess you have Romans 13 here being referenced. You're letting them know. And by the way, this is from the Bible,
right.
And that's from page 3 of the whole document. Again, on how this is different and how it'd probably be laughed at. You open up an Amicus Brief, and table of authorities. Your number one authority is the Holy Bible.
Right.
I think other people, professing Christians, they may quote the Bible in there for political or poetic reasons, but they're not going to list it as a table of authority before constitutional provisions and cases. Case law, like there's just physically looking at this, case law is the authority. Like what has been previously ruled in other cases, like that is and has been the authority. And you've and that's the problem.
I was going to say, in Microsoft Word, it has, like if you do a table of authorities, it has its own like default hierarchy. Okay, this is really interesting.
Wow.
And the default number 1 is cases, is case law. Then you have statutes, and the Constitution is under that.
That is incredible.
And so I actually had to go in and code it.
It's like underlining it.
I want the Holy Bible, then the Constitution, and then somewhere down below that, then cases.
Yeah.
So.
And because it's a reality in our culture, like that this isn't just in Microsoft Word or in the way that like the reality is how have we got to the place that we've gotten to is because the Word of God is not authority in our culture. That's why we have abortion already. And so, whereas we are trying to change laws, we are trying to change court rulings and opinions and the way that we law and policy. That's the main thing that we are always constantly trying to do is get our country from our leaders, from the head to the sole of the foot, to return to God. Yes. And that this is falling within that larger prophetic work of what the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ is supposed to do. And is not sort of separating itself out from that work, which is why I think I opened the PDF when you sent it, and not that I had any reason to suspect that it would be bad, but like you sent it, and I opened up the PDF and I looked at it, and I only had to look at it for as long as it took to know, does this document still fit within the broader gospel of the kingdom mission of the church, the gospel of the kingdom mission of the abolitionist movement? It does. And so that is why it is so different. Mm-hmm. So, but let's get to the real meat of it if we can.
Yeah. So in section 1, really kind of one of my thoughts, what I was trying to do in section 1 was to really address those who care about the institution of the court, right? John Roberts, I think, is perceived as, really caring, sometimes at least being perceived that he cares more about the institution of the court than he does about individual cases themselves.
Yeah.
And how the court is perceived, and that its authority is legitimate, and that it's in some ways arrogating more power to itself. I think it's something that he cares about, or at least is perceived to do so. So in some ways, that's what section 1 is doing, is talking to talking to those folks, talking to Chief Justice Roberts and others like him, who care about the institution of the court, and really telling them that, ultimately the authority of the court, or the public respect of the court, is tied closely to the Constitution. And Roe versus Wade undermines the Constitution. And every case that affirms it, and every day that goes by that it's left in place, the foundation of the court, which is the Constitution, the document that created it, is being undermined. And at some point, if the court continues to do that and continues to allow that, it's going to undermine it to such an extent that it just completely collapses. So again, that's why I say we're coming as friends of the institution of the court.
Yeah.
And that is that what's best for the court is to follow the Constitution. And what's best for the Constitution and the court is what's best for the country, and that's to follow God.
Yeah.
And so that's really what I spend a lot of time talking about in Section 1.
And you've got a bit of an argument in there about kind of like the people have sort of let this happen. Like you kind of develop this idea that, well, if the people will value the Constitution, the people are going to value the court in so much as the court. But you're nodding at the fact that we've got this situation where what we've bred instead is a people that sort of just submit to the court regardless of what the court does. And I reread that this morning and thought to myself, is there a part of these people that are kind of like, yes, that's right, and we're glad. We're glad that we are seen as the Constitution or not? Is that something that's going on? And I think that they're getting briefs from attorneys at law telling them, oh, by the way, kind of the jig is up. This sort of just, you think you're the Constitution. There's all of us, all of these organizations, these legislators, we're telling you your legitimacy is on the line. How do you retain your legitimacy?
Right.
By being constitutional. And I think that again, that's refreshing that they're reading that. You actually see these debates very early on, like in the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, like in discussions about the court and whether the court's going to have too much power or not. It's like, no, well, the court's not going to have too much power because they've got to be constitutional and so on and so forth. And
because they're the weakest branch, because their respect or their ability to actually have their decisions enforced depends upon the respect of the people. And that's gotten so messed up is the people think that it doesn't matter how much they respect the court is the authority no matter what.
Yeah.
And so it's bringing that, like, the people are actually, this amicus is like a symbol of the people becoming a check on the court once again that they have not been.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of at the end of a long part where I'm talking about how the people are treating the Supreme Court and really treating them, much more highly than they should. I say this quote, this is on page 14. The court in Roe has said that evil must be allowed to run rampant in our land, contrary to God's commands to magistrates to restrain it. But if God commands one thing and the court commands another, whom do we obey? If Americans are unwilling to say no to the court, what have we made it? If Americans are unwilling to say no to evil, what does that make us? Ooh. And after I say, if Americans are willing to say no to the court, what have we made it? I have a little footnote there that then says, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me.
Yeah.
Because what I'm saying is that if we're unwilling to say no to the court, as I say later in the brief, if we grant it unconditional submission, then we've made it God. We've made it an idol. And if Roe is evil and we're unwilling to say no to it, what does that make us? Rhetorically, I don't answer the question, but it should be obvious. It makes us evil.
Yeah.
And so that's
where the rubber kind of meets the road. I mean, there's a certain sense where the court's supposed to read this, but I wish everyone would read this. Like, we could just get normal, like we could kind of create a pamphlet version of this, I mean, I know it's available to be read online and so on and so forth, but there's a lot of instruction in general here for just people, because I think you said maybe early on about like the authority and the consent of the governed. When there's something really, really evil going on in the United States of America for 4.5 decades, we can't just blame the Supreme Court or presidents.
Right.
We really do have to look at ourselves and say, like, well, they designed a system wherein the consent of the governed and we the people, for the people, by the people, of the people really did have a very strong role in what happens and not happens. And so, you know, yeah, that it's good, it's in there, and we should get everyone to read that as well.
Just to wrap up this section, section 1, just from page 15, I think it'd be good to read this whole section here. It says, ultimately, the court's egregious decision in Roe is an affront to God and a malignancy that must be excised. It finds no basis in the text of the Constitution. Indeed, its holdings run completely contrary to the text of the Constitution, flouting both its text and spirit. As a result, the Roe decision and the court's repeated refusal to overrule it has undermined public respect for the Constitution, for the court as an institution, for the court's rulings in general, and for the value of human life itself, which God commands magistrates to protect by administering justice. Furthermore, the disregard for the rule of law demonstrated in Roe has metastasized into other areas. Ultimately, if the court does not amputate Roe from its body of jurisprudence, it will further fester and rot the foundations of our republic and its institutions. It will further invite the righteous judgment of God. Like, I don't think you're going to find that kind of thing in any other briefing out there.
That's
at least not in this century.
Yeah, that's really good. And you were saying, Russell, you wanted to, just before we went on there, you wanted to make a meme out of this, just because, man, that is so dang good.
Bradley sometimes is, you know, he's that attorney guy who's, you know, laying out this sort of really reasonable argument or whatever, but then you get these flourishes of malignancy and festering. Things need to be excised and all stuff. So I think it's beautiful, but I think it's this whole section, you basically telling him, here's what the state of the situation is. Like, you don't deserve respect. I mean, it's like, we're letting you know what time it is. And you know that you're inviting the righteous judgment of God. And
the republic is rotting because of your wickedness and your refusal to actually apply the text of the Constitution, right? Because of your, you know, as you talked about, you know, Roberts, like you know, we saw in the Obamacare case, he saw all the terrible arguments that Sebelius was making, and he recognized that, it seemed, in the oral arguments. But then CNN and all the news put all the pressure on him. Oh, the reputation of the court is in jeopardy if Roberts doesn't uphold this. And because of all that pressure about the reputation of the court, he flips. Because of that, because the justices have not held obedience to God and faithfulness to the Constitution as what they're trying to do, the republic is rotting, and this is one of the sources of that rot. So really,
well,
really
and
good.
You mentioned the Obamacare case. I think that is a classic case of Justice Roberts doing what Justice Roberts does. Yeah. And I mean, he's a brilliant man. I mean, you can't say that about every Supreme Court justice for all time. I mean, they're obviously all at least politically brilliant to get there.
Yeah.
But he is a brilliant man from everything I've seen in his writings. You know, and in the Obamacare case, I mean, I will say it is a stroke of brilliance how he handled that from his perspective. Now, obviously, I think the outcome was wrong. But what he did in that case is kind of what I actually, and maybe this, you know, this gets to the underlying case of, you know, Mississippi versus Jackson Women's Health and what may end up happening here. Maybe we can talk about that just briefly before we move to section 2. But I think what he did there is what I expected he would like to do with this case, and that is, in the Obamacare case, he gave with one hand and took with the other. Right, which is kind of a classic kind of Marbury versus Madison kind of thing to do.
Right.
He said he upheld Obamacare, but he said it violates the Commerce Clause. Right, so he kind of took back control of the Commerce Clause and kind of reined it in and did some good stuff on that front. But then he upheld it under the power to tax, saying it was a tax, which of course President Obama had said it's not a tax,
right?
But he said it is a tax, and they do have the power to do this kind of a tax. So in some ways, and he did it in such a way that President Obama, even though Roberts took a lot of stuff that Obama probably did not want him to take, nevertheless, because he gave him the ultimate victory with Obamacare, he was able to do it and kind of thread that needle in a very kind of Marbury versus Madison-esque kind of a way. I could see him doing something similar, or at least wanting to. Now, there's one more, Republican appointed justice, so it may be a little bit harder for him to take as much control. But with this case, what I would expect, and I'm not a prophet as far as seeing the future, but I'm going to make it just an educated guess. What I would expect, and the reason, because I even asked, why did they take up this case? Yeah. Unless they're going to do something about Roe versus Wade. What I would expect is that I think that they are going to uphold the 15-week ban in Mississippi.
Yeah.
But in doing so, I think they are going to double down on affirming Roe versus Wade. That's what I would expect. Now, again, I don't know the future, but that's what I would expect them to do.
Yeah, I don't know the future either. But whenever they said, "Hey, we're gonna hear this," and I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, of course they're going to hear. Like, as more and more states start seeing bills of total and immediate abolition, and as the rhetoric of ignore Roe, or as the court can just pound sand, grows, it makes a lot of political sense for the institution of the Supreme Court. Say, like, can we take up a case? Can we basically try to give the pro-lifers a victory of some sort,
right? And
and then also sort of retain the legitimacy of our authority. They'll appreciate us. Right. And so to me, it's just an evil opportunity for them to basically say, yes, states have the right to curtail abortion at 15 weeks. This doesn't jeopardize the fundamental ruling of Roe v. Wade. And they'll try to sort of make everybody happy. Now, of course, that's the sort of thing that you're warning them against doing, and hopefully, and it's not necessarily between the lines. It's very blatant. You're not actually writing this brief on behalf of that ruling. You're wanting them to go much further than that.
Well, and I think it's important to point out, even just on the front of the brief, because normally when you do an amicus brief, it's either support of petitioners or it's in support of respondent. We're very clear. It says in support of neither party.
Yeah.
Right. Because we believe we have arguments that that relate to the case.
Yeah. And which is why you can submit it.
But we're not here to defend a 15-week ban. That's not why we're here.
Right.
And of course, we're certainly not here to defend Roe versus Wade. So that's why we're in support of neither party, but we have arguments that relate to this case. That's what I would expect the court to do in this case. And, and in some ways, it's kind of what I've said for a long time, and that is, even for people who say, "Oh, we want the Supreme Court to overturn Roe," and as we'll talk about in a minute, Section 2, I think that is the best way, to abolish abortion, is for them to right their own wrong, but that's not the only way, as we'll talk about.
Yeah, It may not even be the likely way.
It may not even be the likely way. But even if people say that's what we want, the best way to do that is by pushing for abolition, pushing for states to do it regardless, because it's then going to compel the court, in order to protect their own authority and their own power, to do it themselves, lest, as I've said before, lest they be exposed as being a paper tiger.
Yeah.
And so I think the move of abolition, or the movement of abolition, if the Supreme Court upholds a 15-week ban, I think it's because of a lot of states that are pushing back. And so the Supreme Court's got to try to take some of the wind out of those sails by giving, like you said, giving the pro-life movement, a small victory, but a victory that, will probably make a lot of people, okay enough with it to kind of take the wind out of
it. But ultimately delays abolition, and I don't want to move on, because I want people to understand the court is not being asked to agree with abolition. Like that's not what's before them.
Not by the state of Mississippi.
Not by the state of Mississippi.
They are being asked that by Bradley Pierce in the abolitionist movement.
Yeah, you're taking the opportunity to say, no, this whole thing needs to be thrown out.
Yeah.
But the people who see something like a 15-week ban and that it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, they're like, this is our opportunity to repeal Roe. And you're like, it's not even challenging the fundamental holding of Roe.
Yeah.
And it would be very strange for the court to be like, not only are we going to give you the 15-week ban, but we're going to criminalize abortion.
Yeah, and you can see that in the other amicus briefs. I haven't read all of them yet, but I have read a number of them. Now I think there's one or two in there that do actually call for Roe to be overturned. I think the AG of Mississippi actually mentioned in there that she wants Roe to be overturned. However, like 80-90% of those documents, of those briefs, are just the standard line. This is a very moderate step. How could the Supreme Court be an abortion extremist type stuff? Just allow us this moderate step is the primary line of the pro-life movement right now, which is crazy. Which is just crazy, and that's why I hope a lot of them. Bradley, you and I just talking about this a couple months ago. You said that one of the main reasons I want to write this is so that the pro-life organizations and lawyers and lobbyists can read this, and so they can hopefully be convicted by this stuff, and that it can serve as an educational tool both for the Supreme Court, but also for these pro-life leaders who are making all these not good arguments before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that some of them hopefully look at it and go like, we can do that? We can argue this?
Yeah.
Like, yes, you can and should.
Yeah.
Right. Model.
Well, and you mentioned this is Bradley Pierce saying this, but I just want to point out we've got 21, organizations in support of this brief.
Yep.
And we've got 20 state legislators from states across the country that have signed on to this brief too. So I wrote the words, but they're words that a lot of people, got behind and added a ton of strength.
Yeah.
As far as filing it. So I'm super grateful for all those organizations, signing on to it and supporting it and even financially backing it. Very much grateful for that.
Yeah, and just to switch gears here, back to our 2.2, we haven't addressed that yet. I'll just recap it real quick so you can comment on it. Where the court does not restrain its authority within its legitimate bounds, the court impels those faithful to the Constitution to seek redress via other constitutional avenues.
Yeah, so what I talk about there is that, in other countries, like in Great Britain today, the members of parliament still today, they swear an oath. And they swear an oath to the Queen and to her lawful successors. But in America, we don't. In America, in almost every single state, our public officials swear an oath to a written constitution, to support and uphold a written constitution. They don't swear an oath to a queen, to a president, or to a court, or to a court ruling. They swear to a constitution. They swear, so help me God. And so it's to the Constitution that we owe our first allegiance as public officials, and even I as an attorney swear an oath to that same Constitution. And so, that's where our allegiance is. And, as John Adams and many others said, and even before our country, was an independent nation, we are a government of laws and not of men.
Yeah.
Meaning that, we're not subject to the arbitrary whim of a man or a woman, a king or a queen, or a group of small group of people, which would be an oligarchy. Yeah. Right? We're a government of laws, written laws, and where a man or a group of men, say something that violates that written law, to whom have you sworn your oath? To that group, like the Supreme Court, or to that Constitution?
Yeah.
And so where the court differs from the Constitution, then we have to follow the Constitution, not the court. Although we should defer to the court, right? The court is the constitutional institution, tasked with interpreting the Constitution in most cases and things like that. And so, if the cases are kind of close or vague, we defer to the court. But where it clearly violates the Constitution, and even more importantly, where it clearly violates God's law, then we follow the Constitution, and we follow, of course, God's law. Like I say, where the court ignores the Constitution, we must ignore the court.
Yeah, what's interesting is how phony and ceremonial the parliamentarians' oath to the monarch is nowadays. It's just the same as a lot of our oath to the Constitution is. Right. It's just the same now.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah. That's right.
That's interesting. One thing maybe I'll ask you to respond to. So an argument that a lot of pro-lifers and pro-life leaders make, like specifically this is something, we hit a back and forth with Jonathan Van Maren, who's a pretty prominent pro-life writer and podcaster. And one of the things he was saying on a podcast recently, or maybe 2-3 months ago, he was saying that ignoring Roe, it doesn't just nullify Roe, it nullifies the authority of the whole literally nullifies the Supreme Court. And not just Van Maren, kind of a pro-life kind of thought leader guy. I mean, I've heard Greg Treat, like the leader of the pro tem, the pro tem of the state Senate here in Oklahoma, say things like that. He says, we can't rebel. A state rebelling against the Supreme Court is a state rebelling against the Constitution, and so you'll hear this sort of objection from pro-lifers. So maybe just from your kind of legal perspective, why are they wrong when they object to abolition bills in that way?
Right. Yeah. Let me just read it. Let me just read something I wrote here.
Yeah.
I pointed out that we don't swear an oath to the court, but to the Constitution. I said, if the court demands unconditional submission, that is unconditional submission, right?
Yeah.
Submission without question, it makes itself a tyrant. If we grant it unconditional submission, we make it an idol. Instead, the court should submit to the highest authority from whom it derives its powers, and the people should appeal to the ultimate lawgiver from whom all powers are delegated. So if someone says, we're ultimately nullifying the courts, that person is implicitly saying we should grant unconditional submission to the court.
Yeah.
Right? If they're saying that there's no line that the court could cross to which we should say no, then they're saying we must give unconditional submission to the court.
And that is as important as the question. Like whenever you have a guy like Van Maren who's like, hey, listen, I'd love to ignore Roe to save babies, but man, we can't dismantle the authority of the Supreme Court. Like that's almost as bad. And it's an age-old argument. Like law and order. Like we can't do this good thing for the babies if it's gonna cost us this greater evil of delegitimizing the court.
Yeah, it makes it so that all authority is legitimate authority. You can't have anything the court ever says be incorrect. It has to be correct.
Which is what they've done this. I mean, even whenever like Scalia and people are writing different things during the Planned Parenthood v. Casey debate, they're like, well, this whole stare decisis thing comes up. It's like, listen, we know that Roe v. Wade decision was junk, but we kind of have to like uphold it, because if we don't, we're kind of saying that we're not legitimate.
Right. Well, and I deal with this, this head on in the brief, because essentially what that person is saying, if they're saying, hey, wait a second, this could really cause a lot of turmoil if we just started saying no to the U.S. Supreme Court, right? I have this section in the brief, it's on page 23. Says that admittedly, we admit that these constitutional available remedies, that is, these various things through the federal, but especially through the states, ignoring Roe, are more disruptive. They are more disruptive than the court overruling Roe itself.
Yeah.
But they are not as disruptive as allowing continuous mass prenatal genocide or the continual undermining of the rule of law. And I kind of expound on that. And that's the point. It's like, should the court overturn Roe? Would that be the least disruptive means of dealing with this issue? Should it go even further and establish equal protection under the Constitution? Absolutely yes, and that would be the least disruptive way of going about this, and that's what we want.
Yeah,
but they have not done that in 48 years.
But if they're not going to do it,
we believe they're not going to do that unless they're made to do that by the states rising up to do it themselves. And so that's why they're violating the rule of law. They're trampling on the Constitution. Every day that goes by is a disruption, to the rule of law and them doing that. And every day that goes by, we have more than 2,300 babies made in the image of God that are being slaughtered in our land. And so if we want to talk about disruption, people say, like, as I address here, people say, like, wait a second, we're going to mess up our peaceful situation. We're already at war. We don't have a peaceful situation. We have hundreds of thousands being slain a year. We have the Civil War, equal to the Civil War's casualties every single year in babies. And that's what we have. So
Yeah.
we're already there.
Yeah, when people say
so-
things like you're going to cause chaos, you're going to cause like in this argument or any like if you abolitionists are going to cause a war, like that rhetoric, you're kind of like as if abortion isn't actually the thing causing the war, and as if there's not a war going on every day already. It just fundamentally they just don't get it.
Yeah, that was the thing.
Also, here's the thing: those same people say, "Well, the court should overturn Roe." It's like,
why?
You do realize that itself will be disruptive to our country.
Yeah.
And in fact, that itself will be the Supreme Court ignoring the Supreme Court. You do realize that, right?
Yeah. That was one of the things that on that same podcast that Van Maren said his stuff. His co-host Josh, or the actual host who was hosting Van Maren was Josh Brom, and Josh Brom said that to basically allow states to ignore Roe, to do what one of the things you're advocating here in Section 2 is to allow anarchy, and that's another argument pro-lifers make. It's anarchy. It's people just doing whatever they want. It's like no, like as you said, brother, this is upholding the law. Those who are destroying the law are those who say that genocide is legal. Those who give approval to murder. They are the law breakers. A governor, a state legislator, a state judge, or a state Supreme Court justice who says, no, murder is actually illegal under the Constitution. It violates the law of God egregiously. And here in the state of Oklahoma, Texas, Indiana, Idaho, wherever, we are not going to tolerate that. That's the law keeper. Right, but a lot of the pro-life leaders want to make that governor or that state legislator or whoever, they want to make that person out to be an anarchist.
Yeah,
but they're actually the law keeper.
Such a bizarre claim, because anarchists typically are not in the practice of putting laws into place.
Yeah, and that, I mean, we specifically even say in the brief, we repudiate violent acts of aggression through vigilantism or mob action. Furthermore, we oppose popular revolution. Right? We believe in government. We believe that God creates government and He gives them legitimate authority. We believe in that. But we believe that right now we don't have a rule of law in America. We have a rule of men. We have a rule of a court. We want to return to a rule of law. We want laws, right? Passed by lawfully elected officials to ultimately follow the highest law of the land, earthly law, the Constitution. That's what we want.
So one other thing to maybe touch on in this section. So you break it down into three different ways, or is it four? Three.
Well, I talk about three different ways.
Yes.
I talk about
other constitutional avenues.
Yeah. So just to talk about the kind of the avenues that you lay out for ways that that states and other constitutional officials can resist the courts if the courts don't do us right.
Yeah, so one way, I start with saying that, we could amend the federal Constitution, right? But then I say, the states could, those who oppose Roe could seek to amend the federal Constitution, but should they? And essentially, long story short, no, I don't believe that we should seek to amend the Constitution for a number of reasons. First of all, it implies that the Constitution needs to be amended.
Yeah, which it does.
And that is somehow defective, which it's not. It's also extremely slow, and we have to have, I believe, 38 states, sign on in order to do that. And finally, even if we do amend it, the problem isn't with the text of the Constitution. The problem is that there's a court that's ignoring the text of the Constitution. So you can change the text all you want, but if they're going to ignore it, then what have you really done? You haven't dealt with the root issue.
Yeah, like I like to always say, if the Constitution literally had a line in it saying, mothers have the right to terminate their babies, and this is their constitutional right. Like if it was blatantly like that, or if it said no state has the right to prohibit the killing of children in the womb, we would have to amend the Constitution. But since the Constitution doesn't say that, I think even going down that road is kind of like admitting something that we don't need to admit. So I think that I think that's lost on a lot of people. Unfortunately, that's kind of the whole pro-life movement's strategy, is to sort of like abort Roe or repeal Roe, and so that rhetoric just comes along with it.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's talk about the second one here. So those who are so now we're going to get into the two options that we abolitionists think should be pursued. So the first one, those who oppose Roe may pursue other federal level remedies. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's different remedies that we could pursue through Congress or the president, if the president were willing to. Congress could limit the jurisdiction of the federal courts, saying that they don't have the authority to tell states not to outlaw, prenatal homicide.
Which is what Ron Paul tried to do for a few years there, I believe, right? But every year it never got any attention, like from any of the pro-life groups or any of the other pro-life people in Congress. So
that's right. Yeah, and I cite one of his bills there where he tried to do that.
Very good.
We could do what's called court packing, which we have right now. Prominent Democrat senators are talking about doing, and if the Supreme Court even does anything positive on the pro-life side, they're talking about court packing, which is adding members to the court in order to let a Democrat president fill the court, so it now becomes majority Democrat appointee. And the reason I talk about that is it's like, well, that sounds horrible. Well, it is a bad idea in the sense that it's very disruptive, and it's kind of a tit for tat kind of thing, right? One side does it, then the other side's going to do it, and it's going to be very disruptive. But it's not unconstitutional, right? It's perfectly constitutional for Congress to do that, and so it is something to be considered, and it is something on the table to bring things back within. Yes, it would be more disruptive than the court overturning Roe itself, but it would be less disruptive than the current situation. So again, the Democrats using it in order to perpetuate child murder and to create additional disruption, that's wrong. But it's not wrong because it's unconstitutional. It's wrong because it's promoting child murder.
It'd be interesting.
Us, using court packing in the other direction is an option.
Yeah, with our current success rate on justices getting through, they're actually going to work to abolish abortion. It's you add 30, you might get 10 that are actually for it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why I throw it out as an option. Yeah. It's not necessarily the best option.
Yeah, it seems like the never-ending option. It's like, well, you get your president, and he puts 8 more on there, and then we'll get a president. He'll put 10 more on there, and we have 100 people on the Supreme Court. It should tell people, this is not the route you should take. There's nothing permanent here. Yeah. It just seems to be, it makes the court, which I would say is very political. I mean, the Supreme Court is a political institution. Yeah. But it makes we got to elect a pro-life president so he can pack the court in the right direction. It's like, stop using the Supreme Court to make laws. Just stop it.
Right.
Yeah.
Take this other route.
Yeah, I think what is an important point is, I think, is kind of, as you kind of put it on the table. Like court packing isn't something the Abolish Abortion Texas has ever advocated for explicitly, but it's important to put things on the table because, as we touched on briefly in the last section, like John Roberts and I mean it's looking like Brett Kavanaugh as well. They're kind of leaves in the wind, just trying to find the middle of wherever the current cultural winds are blowing, and trying to look like the moderate to kind of keep both sides happy. That is their method of constitutional interpretation. Like that's how those guys operate. And so when threats come from the left and people who want to promote child sacrifice, it's important that equal pressure is coming from our side. And so just kind of putting all the options on the table here and saying, look, here's all the different ways that we can disrupt what you're doing if you do not do justice. So just kind of a putting of all of the options on the table, saying here are the things that we can do, to resist you if you don't do right.
And this is how you hold the court accountable, right? Yep. I mean, that's the reason that these options are on the table, because like you said, they put pressure and they're also a way to hold them accountable. Again, they're not the only way, they're not necessarily the best way, but they're something that we should keep on the table and we should push for. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. Impeaching justices who do bad things, who support Roe, or the president. Mm-hmm. The president basically ignoring Roe and refusing to enforce Roe.
Right, and we have a really good historical example of that, right? We've got Abraham Lincoln, who obviously we don't appreciate everything about Abraham Lincoln, but one of the really good things that he did for the cause of fighting against slavery was the Supreme Court said no. And in Dred Scott, they said no, black people like Dred Scott are not actual citizens. They cannot be issued passports or any kind of state identification. And Lincoln's like, nope. I direct the executive branch, and I am directing the Secretary of State to print passports for black people. And so black people were essentially granted citizenship in defiance of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
That's one of the, obviously, Lincoln clashed with the abolitionists a lot, but that's one of the good things that he did do, for the cause.
And the ideological thing there that he said that was kind of cool is like, well, the Supreme Court can enforce their rule if they want to, which just exposes the fact that they don't have an army.
Yeah.
They're not a lawmaking. That's the sentiment that should be going forth in the states. Like, okay, we've abolished abortion, upholding the Constitution and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. We're right with God here. The Supreme Court disagrees. Well, okay, what you going to do about it? That has to be stated.
On the topic of options, just quick question here, Bradley. Has a Supreme Court justice ever been criminally charged for a very bad decision?
I'm not aware of it if they're ever being for a decision, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wishful thinking, I guess.
Well, in this case, there's debate about this, but there's a question of whether they would even need to be criminally charged, because they hold their terms for good behavior. And so good behavior is a very, what does that mean? It means whatever whatever Congress says it means. This is one area where the Constitution, I think, is purposely ambiguous in order to let Congress decide what they think that means.
Yeah, and real quick before we move on here, we've gotten a rabbit trail. I think it's been a very good rabbit trail, but just to kind of wrap up the rabbit trail, like here in Oklahoma, I think it's not good behavior, but I think it's moral turpitude. I think it's anything that the Oklahoma judge, if he violates the principles of moral turpitude, then he can be impeached. And as we've said, that's up to the discretion of the legislature to determine, has this judge displayed moral turpitude, and so something that I think for the first bill that's had something like this in it is the South Carolina bill, the bill of abolition that Jonathan Hill put forward, and it actually has a clause in there about impeaching, not just ignoring the Supreme Court or the federal judiciary, but actually impeaching state judges and justices if they don't uphold the right to life because it's moral turpitude, or I don't know whatever the phrase in South Carolina is. If they violate the Constitution and don't protect their right to life, it's immoral or bad behavior or moral turpitude, whatever it is, and they can be impeached. And so I think that's probably going to be a bigger part of abolition bills going forward, is to kind of emphasize the fact that we can impeach, or the legislature saying we can impeach you, and if you approve of genocide, we're going to impeach you. So yeah, I'm really excited to see that in more abolition bills going forward.
I just this last week wrote another bill for another state, and I put that in there.
Nice, very good. Yep. So yeah, I guess anything else on that, or move on to point 3, or point 3 within point 2. So those who oppose Roe may pursue state-level remedies. Now, this is kind of the main one that the abolitionists kind of operate in.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this stuff isn't like you do this and then this happens. But if states started passing abolition bills, like if that became a normal thing, like state after state passed it, I think you and I have talked about this and agreed on this. At that point, that's when the Supreme Court's like, oh man, we're being disregarded. We better meet and tell the states that they're allowed to do this. And I think that is sadly how the court functions. That's how they functioned in regard to gay marriage, for instance. That's why you have a court that's saying gay marriage is not constitutional. Oh, never mind. Now it is. Why? Because a bunch of states were like, they were going to uphold gay marriage, regardless of what the Supreme Court does. So I think that if you were going to, you can't predict the future, and maybe you can probably predict the future a little bit better than others on this because you've studied it. Do you think, regardless of all these other avenues, regardless of different things and different strategies, that really the only way we're ever going to see the Supreme Court repeal Roe is if states abolish it first in disregarding them? I mean, is that ultimately
that's
what
my
you
belief.
Think
that's my belief, because that's what would hold them accountable. And force them to restrain their own power, or else, again, they're going to appear powerless. And so I believe, that's what needs to be done. And the more states doing it, the better. And it doesn't even have to, some people are like, well, you've never passed a bill. Well, I mean, in some ways, we may not even ever have to pass a bill, although we should, before God, we should pass bills to do this and under our oath to the Constitution. But it may be that if there's enough states that are getting enough traction on this, getting close to passing bills, that even then that would be enough that the Supreme Court would do it themselves.
Yeah, it's the threat of nullification that forces them, it holds them accountable. Exactly. It forces their hand to prevent themselves from being exposed to paper tiger and all that stuff. And that's what we're seeing. Yeah. It's really awesome.
And they may not ever even repeal Roe v. Wade. I mean, they didn't repeal Dred Scott's case. Right. They didn't. It's just kind of moved on, but it's still sitting on the books.
Right.
And I assume.
Yeah, I mean, of course, what I would love to see is, them getting on their knees before God and repenting, for it and for upholding it. That's what I would want. That's what I pray for. But at the very least, I'll take them doing it for pragmatic reasons.
Yeah.
But I want them to do it for the right reasons.
Right. So real quick, while we're on this one, so just explain kind of the legal argument that you lay out in part 2C here. So you talk mostly about the Supremacy Clause, which I think we're probably in agreement is one of, if not the most misunderstood parts of the whole U.S. Constitution. So just to talk about the right understanding of the Supremacy Clause and what it should mean, and then, or I guess maybe start with the wrong interpretation that's the predominant one, and then explain what it actually means.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you talk to most people who use the phrase the Supremacy Clause, they always say, well, the Supremacy Clause means that federal law trumps state law. Period. That's the end of it. That's the end of the discussion.
Yeah.
And what they fail to add to that is that it says that federal law, trumps state law only if it's constitutional. And this because the Supremacy Clause says that this Constitution and the laws which shall be made in pursuance thereof, in pursuance of the Constitution, shall be the supreme law of the land. That's what it says. And so, yes, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land as far as earthly law, and yes, it's supreme. And yes, laws made pursuant to it, that is within its jurisdiction, laws that don't violate it, are the supreme law of the land. But Roe is not that, right? Yeah. Roe is not. Even if you admit that, even if you say it's a law, but because it's a case law, for example, it's not made pursuant to the Constitution,
right?
And so therefore, the Supremacy Clause implicitly says, then it's not the law of the land. One more thing on this third point, as far as the avenues available to us, and that is that kind of getting back to the unconditional submission thing, and that is that we've got to say there's a line. We have to say that there's a line.
Yeah.
We have to say that, the Supreme Court is not the supreme being, right? And as I put it here, we must adamantly deny that the power to authorize the genocide of more than 62 million preborn human beings over the last 48 years and counting is within the legitimate authority of the federal judiciary. I mean, anyone who says, well, Supremacy Clause means that we can't ignore Roe, they're saying that authorizing this genocide is within their legitimate authority, and we've got to deny that. Yeah. We cannot say that, or else we're saying they're God.
That's why I think people like Abby Johnson will just say that legalized abortion is constitutional, because they have that view where they'll actually change the Constitution based on what the court says in their own mind. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's really sad that the pro-life movement does that, but it's really awesome that they're going to, hopefully, a lot of them, at least kind of the pro-life legal side, is going to have to read stuff like this, and hopefully they'll be able to kind of rethink their views a little bit. So,
so we can move on to Section 3 here. So I'll just reread it here. In addition to overruling Roe, the court should recognize that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires that state laws protecting born persons against homicide may not deny equal protection to persons not yet born. Bradley, if you just want to talk about that point for a bit here.
Yeah, so the Equal Protection Clause says no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's what the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says. In the brief, I don't really get into, is a preborn baby a person or not, because there are lots of people who've made great arguments on that, even other people who submitted briefs.
Yeah.
So I got into, what does that mean? What does equal protection mean?
Yeah.
And really took us all the way back to, Roe versus Wade in 1973, where we have even the attorney for Roe, Sarah Weddington, she's pointing out how the laws of Texas and the laws of most states, even then in 1973, did not provide equal protection, right? And so it's kind of disingenuous for Texas and other states to be arguing that, that a fetus is a person when our laws at the time don't even treat them as persons. And the way that we didn't is because, we said that mothers had a license to kill them, right? Mothers are completely exempt and excluded. They're immune from any form of prosecution or legal penalty whatsoever, and because the penalties were different, and in fact they were based on the harm to the mother. And so the penalty for abortion, like for example in Texas, which was the Roe case, was 2 to 5 years if you get an abortion. Oh, but if the mother dies, then it's murder, right? Then if that happens, then there's enhanced penalties, because or if it's against her will, then it's double penalties if it's against her consent. So again, it's really, as Sarah Weddington, the attorney for Roe, said, this is not equal protection. They're not treating a fetus like a person. And so we're making the same point here that a fetus is a person. And so states should be required to treat them as persons by protecting them by the same laws that protect born persons.
Yeah, one of the really annoying things on this is how much actual disagreement with this argument there is, even among like pro-life and anti-abortion like lawyers and like thought leaders. I know Josh Craddock has kind of been leading the charge, for the equal protection argument for a long time, but he gets a lot of pushback on that point from people who write for prominent conservative legal publications. And one of the ways that I've been explaining it recently is that if there's like some if person doesn't actually mean human being, like if there's some exception in the 14th Amendment that allows us to kind of draw out a different class of humans and say that they don't actually fit within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, if that's legitimate, then the 14th Amendment really doesn't do anything at all, because the whole purpose there was a part of the abolition of slavery. And so it was saying never again will a state be allowed to just choose a group of humans and deny them the equal protection of the laws. That was the whole purpose there, right? And so if we can just draw out a group of humans who that doesn't apply to, then we can draw out any group of humans who it just won't apply to. And so it doesn't actually protect black people or white people or older. It doesn't do anything unless it protects all, because if it doesn't protect all, then any group can just be pulled out and denied equal protection. And so I think it's a really preposterous argument, and I just don't understand how this is such the anti-equal protection argument. I do not understand how it is so common among pro-life and conservative lawyers. That's a really confusing thing to me. I don't know if you're more in that world, obviously, than any of us are. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, ultimately, like you said, if the court can define person to mean anything other than a living human being, then you've just opened the door to the Holocaust, right? Yep. Because you can say this is a subhuman over here. They're not a person,
which is what they
so
did.
that's an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I think there are some people who do make, some pro-life lawyers who do make some arguments that, that I think they are understandable. They say there's this whole legal doctrine or criminal procedure about that if you have one party to a crime testifying against another party to the crime, a principal and accomplice, or two principals kind of thing, that you have to have, the evidence has to be have to have additional corroboration, right, of the evidence in order to get a conviction. And so because of that, because both the mother and the abortionist are parties to the same crime, it does make it more difficult to prosecute them under that criminal procedure. And so that's why they were immune, right? That's one of the arguments that's made. I say it's not a very strong argument, because there's still plenty of ways to corroborate it with other evidence. Mm-hmm. And especially today, with the technology that we have, with the forensic analysis that we have, if that argument ever held any water, it holds zero today. And then, they make other arguments about, well, what about mothers who are forced to do something? Well, we already have a legal doctrine of duress. Or what about mothers who don't know what they're doing? Well, we already have a legal defense of mistake of fact. So we already have these things in our law that we agree should apply equally to everybody, and every case should be decided on a case-by-case basis. That's where what we did before Roe and what pro-life bills have done since Roe has denied that equal protection. Again, we're not saying everybody should get the same outcome. We're saying that everybody should be subject to the same justice system that protects, same justice system that protects born people should equally protect, on people before they're born.
And so this part here on equal protection, it's a real strong rhetorical point, because one of the things, if you read Abby Johnson's commentary, on the bill you guys had there in Texas, Abby Johnson put up some memes, opposing, the bill to abolish abortion there. And if you read the stuff that, she and other pro-life leaders will say about it, it's like, abolitionists are out for blood. They hate women. All this stuff, misogyny. And actually, the SBC ethics professors who wrote against the SBC resolution actually threw misogyny into their argument. And so this is a common type of thing. But for us, it's like, no, we're not criminalizing any person or any gender or anything. Our argument is that preborn children should be equal under the law. That's it. At least for this aspect, preborn children should be equal under the law. Roe is not a binding legal decision. That's our whole thing. And so there's no targeting of gender, targeting of women. It's eradicating the targeting of unborn children, and that's the end of it. There's nothing like what they will try to portray us as. Now here in Oklahoma, the main objection that senators have given here is you're getting rid of our pro-life regulations, and we can't defy the Supreme Court. But in Texas, the main one you guys have dealt with, from Jeff Leach and Abby Johnson and all them, has been this criminalization of the mother thing. Yeah. And you guys have just been pounding the drum. No, we're not criminalizing people. We're making preborn children equal. Yeah. And so it's a very strong rhetorical point, this equal protection thing.
Yeah. We're criminalizing conduct, right? No matter who commits it.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I don't think we'd call the pro-life view misogynistic. It's kind of an overused term, but it definitely thinks very little of women. It thinks they're far too stupid to understand that murder is something that's wrong. Yeah, which is a very low standard.
Yep. And just so people understand, Jeff Leach literally did in his committee say, "I will never let a bill that punishes women come out of my committee." Well, and he's the pro-life hero of Texas or whatever.
Literally the Courageous Defender of Life Award 2019 from Texas Alliance for Life.
So he's trying to be compassionate, but he doesn't realize that he's basically giving up the whole game.
Yeah.
That's what the justices said. Yep. If you're not going to punish the mother as a primary agent here, then
Yeah, and this is a good transition kind of into the next thing we should talk about, which is kind of why we are not in support, all the amici, here who have signed on to this are not in support of either side in this case. Why we are writing against abortion, but we're not actually advocating for a 15-week ban or anything like that. So to talk about that, talk about how the specific Mississippi 15-week ban that's at issue before the court isn't something that we support, and why it isn't something that we support to the point where we're just we're not in support of either side here.
Yeah, well, it's ageist in the sense that it's discriminatory, right? And I don't support bills and laws that discriminate. Yeah. In this case, it's a dehumanizing of any child that does not reach the 15-week gestation. It's treating them as if they're subhuman and saying you do not deserve to be protected. And it's also unconstitutional because, again, like we've talked about, the Equal Protection Clause says no person shall be denied equal protection of the laws. And what does the 15-week ban do? It denies the equal protection of the laws to people under 15 weeks. And so, and it also, I think it implicitly legitimizes Roe versus Wade because I think, yes, people say no, it's challenging Roe versus Wade. Well, it is a little bit, right? It is challenging the viability doctrine a little bit, but it's ultimately legitimizing judicial tyranny, right? Because it's going back to the court and submitting to the court again. Yep. And why is it not going all the way to 0-week ban, right? To a from fertilization ban? because I think they're trying to get the court to chip away just a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And this is why, I was talking with a pro-life group here in Texas once, and they said, listen, we're just trying to overturn Roe. And we said, we want to overturn Roe too, but we want to overturn the very concept of judicial supremacy. And the regulationist bills that you're putting forward are legitimizing and entrenching the very concept of judicial supremacy. Yeah. And when I said that, they pretty much just shook their, they just nodded their heads in agreement. Like, yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm. And that's where the distinction is. The 15-week ban, going up to the court and saying, can we please protect babies from 15 weeks? Again, if you walk away from that and you do whatever the court says, ultimately you're furthering the root problem here, which is judicial tyranny. And you're doing it with a bill that discriminates and it's unconstitutional. And it denies the humanity of the child, created in the image of God from fertilization.
Yeah. And it's all being done in the name of saving some. And then, I don't like making the argument here, but generally speaking, most abortions happen before 15 weeks. And the ones that happen after 15 weeks are only just going to be encouraged to happen prior to 15 weeks. So there's a certain part of this, even the bill and the law that they're writing, even if it was passed and upheld, isn't really going to save any lives anyway.
Mm-hmm. And you could make the argument
quicker.
Yeah, you could make the argument that it could cost more lives, right? Because this is another way you could frame this bill is this is a hurry up and get an abortion before you've had more time to think about it bill.
Yeah.
So there could be people that may have ultimately decided not to get an abortion at week 16 or week 17 once they start feeling the baby kick. But this is saying, hurry up and get an abortion before you can even feel the baby kick. So it could actually lead to more abortions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when I was talking to an ultrasound tech, we had my son, there was possible markers for spina bifida or something like that. And the ultrasound tech started to want to inform me, well, in the state of Oklahoma, you have to make a decision before a certain period. She's somehow letting me know that I have 2 weeks to do this. Well, that's what this bill does. It just basically says hey, you don't get 16 weeks, which is an insane amount of time anyway, which is why most abortions happen long before that. But that's one of our regular things that we're always repeating is the law's kind of a tutor, and it's culturally telling people certain things. Yeah. And so it stinks because a lot of pro-lifers are going to be praising the Supreme Court for upholding Mississippi's right to ban it at 15 weeks. But really all that is just newspaper and post after post basically instructing people abortion is okay if you do it by this period.
Yeah.
And implicit with all that is hurry up and make your abortion choice.
The other thing on top of that, too, is that anyone that can afford a later-term abortion can afford to travel to a state that has a late-term abortion facility. So it's not really going to change anything. The people that are paying $5,000 for a third trimester abortion, a $200, $300 plane ticket isn't going to change that equation at all. Especially since there's pro-abortion organizations that specifically fundraise to fund those women to go and get those abortions.
Yeah. And one thing that we've touched on, we've kind of touched around the edges of, but we haven't just kind of done the whole thing, is the kind of footnote 54 argument, which kind of falls here under Section 3. So just talk about what footnote 54 of the Roe decision says and how that should kind of instruct the way that we go about fighting against abortion and against Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, well, this issue of equal protection is what I call why we lost Roe versus Wade and why we've been losing ever since. I believe it is the main issue. There are others, but it's the main one. And, and the Supreme Court told us what it was in the Roe decision itself. The Supreme Court wrote, and they said, quote, when Texas urges that a fetus is entitled to 14th Amendment protection as a person, it faces a dilemma. Neither in Texas nor in any other state are all abortions prohibited. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you treat a fetus like a person, then all abortions should be prohibited. That's what they're implicitly saying there.
Yeah.
Then they go on, they say, there are other inconsistencies between 14th Amendment status and the typical abortion statute. It has already been pointed out that in Texas, the woman is not a principal or an accomplice with respect to an abortion upon her. If the fetus is a person, why is the woman not a principal or an accomplice? That's the Supreme Court's words, not mine. If the fetus is a person, why is the woman not a principal or an accomplice? Further, the penalty for criminal abortion specified by Article 1195 is significantly less than the maximum penalty for murder prescribed by Article 1257 of the Texas Penal Code. If the fetus is a person, may the penalties be different. Again, that's the court. If the fetus is a person, may the penalties be different. And so this is what the Supreme Court told us back in 1973. They basically said, we're striking down your law because we could go way off into this, but Texas kind of messed up in making really just one argument. And that was a fetus is a person under the 14th Amendment. They should have made additional arguments, but they made that argument. The problem was that actions speak louder than words. That's the problem, right? Our words were saying a fetus is a person, but our actually law and our actual actions that we were taking that the Supreme Court calls us on, we're saying that a fetus is not a person because all abortions are not prohibited, because a mother's not a principal or an accomplice, and because the penalties are different. And so any bill that does not abolish all abortions and does not treat a mother like a principal or an accomplice and does not provide the same penalties is inherently denying equal protection. The Supreme Court told us that in 1973, but the pro-life movement, its leadership, did not listen then and hasn't listened since with the bills that they've been pushing and introducing.
An argument that I'll hear from or that I've read from certain pro-life people, I think it was Clark Forsyth who made this argument. He was saying, well, the Supreme Court was just trying to up the ante for a repeal of Roe. They're trying to make it harder to repeal Roe or whatever, but that's not what they're saying isn't actually true. But it's like, how can what they're saying not be true? If you're going to argue that preborn children are people, how can you not then treat them equally to other people by the law, and so it's like this inconsistency. It undercuts us, both just in our arguments, like the moral argument against abortion. It undercuts us if we're not willing to actually hold to the conclusions of what we're saying at the foundation of our argument. That undercuts us, and pro-aborts will see that, and they'll call out that inconsistency and be like, "Well, you don't actually believe." What you say you believe. Yeah. But then also not only the moral argument, but actually in court. Right, the court. How can the court accept the argument that the fetus is a person if a state is not treating them like a person? It's just it's an inconsistency, and it undercuts us badly in both places.
Yeah, so. I was actually reading it was like a pro-abort blog covering the stuff we did in Philadelphia with the Tubman bill, and so there's all this debate about it and everything, and this pro-choicer gets on there and goes, "Hey. What's really weird, though, about these abolitionist people is they're consistent. Like, I disagree with them, but the pro-lifer who has, like, a rape exception in there, if they really thought that the baby was, like, really a human, like, they wouldn't have that in there. So, like, the world is starting to notice that whenever we call for criminalization and punishment and, equal protection, all that kind of stuff, even our opponents are starting to go, oh, that's refreshing, because these pro-lifers seem to have been undermining themselves the whole time. Mm-hmm. So that's going forward, I think, I would say that's becoming more and more popular overall. I don't think rape exceptions are as common, and I don't expect that immunity is going to be stated as common either. As you said, it's not in Mississippi's bill, right? They don't have a blatant, like, the mother will have immunity.
No, they do not. No, even we have in Texas, we have Texas Right to Life that is now saying, yes, the mother should be subject at some point, but that's another increment, right? So they're kind of already admitting, like, yes, that is to be logically consistent. We do need that.
Yeah, or they'll say, like, first we abolish abortion, ban it, and then maybe in 20 years from now, after that's kind of been ingrained, then we'll start punishing people who break the law. It's just like, no, you teach them now by, making it a law and punishing them.
It will never be ingrained if you do it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do want to read just kind of the concluding kind of paragraph and a half here of this section. I think it was really good. And then if anyone else has anything else to say, we can touch on that. And then if not, then we can move on. So the concluding part here of Section 3. Unfortunately, the legal and public policy work of the pro-life movement has generally failed to adequately address this inconsistency since Roe was decided. The inconsistency of not treating the preborn children like they're fully human. Almost every pro-life policy that has reached this court, including the one under consideration, has been afflicted with at least one of these two denials of equal protection of the laws that the court pointed out in Roe. 1, mothers granted or allowed a blanket license to kill with impunity. And 2, lower available penalty ranges for abortion of a fetus versus comparable homicide of a born person. So all pro-life laws are providing complete immunity. So mothers can murder their child with impunity and nothing will ever happen to them. And 2, the penalty for doing it, even for the abortionist, is less than murder. And so we're saying we don't really believe that these children are people. And then you continue. Ultimately, what is required by the Constitution and logical consistency are not 15-week bans or heartbeat bans or any other partial regulation. Every state already has laws on the books protecting preborn humans from unjustifiable homicide. That is, it is already illegal in every state to murder human beings, but exceptions exist to allow for abortion. The states simply need to repeal those exceptions so that existing homicide laws apply to all human beings. Again, equal protection. As the Constitution requires, we need to provide equal protection of the laws to all persons, both before and after birth. In other words, this is good. This is your kind of rhetorical flourish. This is a really good way to end the section. In other words, what is needed is what is proclaimed on the frieze over the portico of this court's building: equal justice under law. That's good. That's a real good way to conclude that section.
Yeah. So. Point to their own building.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So those are the first 3 sections of the Amicus Brief, and the conclusion I think is also worth going into, just because it's a really good summation of kind of all the things that you've argued. So Bradley, do we want to read kind of what you wrote at the end of this Amicus Brief here?
Sure. Amici urged the court to overrule Roe and to recognize that the Equal Protection Clause requires that state laws protecting born persons against homicide may not deny equal protection to persons not yet born. If the court does not, Amici urge other civil officials and institutions to additionally pursue the abolition of abortion via other peaceful constitutional avenues to fulfill their oaths and God-given duties. And then I quote 2 scriptures here, which I'll read from Psalm 2. Now, therefore, be wise, O kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. And then from Proverbs 24, if you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. Rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. If you say, behold, we did not know this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who keeps watch over your soul know it? And will he not repay man according to his work? That's the end of the brief.
Amen. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really great thing, and I would encourage. We've talked a lot about the different pieces of this. We kind of went through the general format of it. But everyone who's listening to this should go read the whole thing.
Yeah.
Because it's good. That the clerks are going to read it, and hopefully the justices. The clerks are going to be like, holy smokes, what the heck is this? And they're going to hand it to the justices and be like, take a look at this. And hopefully the justices read it, and the pro-life lobbyists and organizations and lawyers read it. But I think abolitionists should read this too, because this is a great teaching tool. Like it's not just a legal, it really is a teaching tool for abolitionists to kind of hone their arguments, maybe learn some things and some legal and some theological things that they haven't heard before. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really good. So Bradley, where can people find this and read the whole thing online?
You can actually go to the Supreme Court's website, supremecourt.gov, and search for the Dobbs case there, and it's in there.
Cool.
So they can get it there, and then we're going to be publishing it on our website for the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, FAA.life. You can find it there, and then we're also going to be. Of course, you can go read it online, but this is actually how it was submitted to the court. It was in a little pamphlet like this. So we're actually going to be taking this and making just a little cover for it, so it doesn't look quite so legalese, and making a cover for that. And we're going to be making that available for anybody who wants to have that and hand that out. So that way that can go forth. So we'll be having that in September, hopefully getting that printed up.
Awesome.
But yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that we've been talking about Free the States is having sort of an internship program that we start in summer and try to have 5 to 10 young college age people come in, and we'd actually not just work them to death, but actually train them. And I've got in my moleskin where I've different things that they can study. I put one a week or so ago. I said to read two amicus briefs, to take the pro-life one. There's like the pro-life one that like all these pro-life governors signed off on, and this one, and read them. Because we've always said, take a pro-life bill and abolition bill, read them both, and compare them to the Word of God. Take this brief and the pro-life brief and look at them, and then you tell me there isn't like a separate movement. Like there's an abolitionist movement, clearly, an abolitionist community, abolitionist ideology and strategy, and then there's this stuff, the pro-life stuff. And I think that for the normal, the person, they're not like high up in the pro-life establishment or industry or whatever you want to call it. It's just a normal pro-life Christian that goes to the church and believes that when they give to pro-life stuff, I think a lot of them probably think that they're supporting something like what you've argued in this brief. They don't know that there really is a game being played. And so one of the things I'm going to want to do, whether it's in the form of a lecture or just in the form of like getting people to do it, it's like, hey, we've got these two things. Read these, compare them. And so even long after this case has been decided, I think it's, you have produced a pamphlet of sorts. You may even actually be able to like sort of slightly tweak it to no longer just be for the Supreme Court, but here's the argument. Which are you already thinking that down the road, that this is a pamphlet in and of itself? So.
Yeah. I mean, now you got me thinking like maybe I should go ahead and put that pro-life bill in the pro-life brief in with this one. I like that idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's definitely sometimes you'll see these books that are just like collected documents. I have a lot of sort of like curated, these are a bunch of documents from the 19th century and you can read them or whatever. I just think that it would be it'd be a nice book where it's like, here's this one, here's questions about them, and then here's like a conclusion. Because it's so wildly different.
Yeah. If you hand this brief and the National Right to Life brief to a Christian, it should be very, very clear which side that they need to be on. And so we're gonna try to get this thing out there as much as we can. We can put. I guess you guys have you've posted the link on your Facebook page a couple times, and so we can go on and get that link. We'll put it in the description of this video, so everyone watching can go and read the entire thing because it's really, really good. And there's one thing you wanted to bring up that's not actually in here, but that you wanted to put in there, but then the word count kind of prohibited it, and you mentioned that you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's something, again, I had started to write up and had it pretty well fleshed out, but then I thought it's a little bit of a rabbit trail, although it relates, but ultimately there's an 8,000 word limit, for what we submit to the court, so we had to cut it to get it within that. But the issue of Romans 13, I wanted to flesh that out a little bit more. Didn't have room in this brief. Maybe that'll be a future brief. We've, and a lot of this we've talked about a lot. You all have talked about this a lot, and that is Romans 13. It's the Supreme Court should be reading Romans 13 in addition to all the rest of us, right? Because what is the governing authority in this country? Well, we've already heard it, and it's told to us all the time. The Constitution, right? That's the governing authority. That's the supreme law of the land. So if all souls should be subject to the governing authority, well, that includes the members of the Supreme Court. And so they need to bring themselves under the follow the Romans 13 and follow the governing authority, the Constitution, and God's law. They should also the Romans 13, you can make the argument it's more prescriptive than descriptive, right? It's saying that a legitimate government does not bear the sword in vain, that legitimate rulers, they are terror to evildoers, not to well-doers, etc. But there's one thing that I've thought of recently that I wanted to share and that I started to write on and did write on, but I had to cut it out. And that is that I think a lot of times when people think about Romans 13, they think about themselves as an individual citizen. And they think about what is my response to the Supreme Court and Roe versus Wade under Romans 13. And that's kind of the end of the analysis. And they say, well, I'm not being told to do something that that violates God's law. So Romans 13 doesn't really apply here. I think where there's a lot of agreement on Romans 13 is this, and that is, I think most Christians agree that Romans 13, or that the Bible tells us a couple of things, and that there are limits to human authority, right? I think almost all Christians agree that there are limits, and the way most people would phrase those limits is that the civil government cannot command you to do something God forbids, right? That's number one. And then number two, the civil government cannot forbid you from doing something that God commands. So we see, like, for example, the Hebrew midwives, they're being commanded to do something God forbids, right? They're being commanded to murder babies, and God forbids that. Or in the New Testament, we see the rulers there forbidding to do something that God commands. God commands to preach the gospel, and so they say we must obey God rather than men, because you're forbidding us from doing something that God commands. So that's where most people agree, even on the whole, the government shutting down churches. Well, no, you're forbidding us from meeting, which God commands us to meet. So that violates that. And so most Christians agree with that. The problem with the issue of abortion is that most people stop with themselves as a citizen, and they don't realize, or they don't take it this far, that the issue is really not about you as a citizen and what is your duty. The issue is the magistrate and what is their duty. Mm-hmm. And Scripture has abundant both commands to magistrate and things forbidden from magistrates, right? Magistrates are commanded to provide justice, to provide impartial justice, and forbidden from oppressing the fatherless, and forbidden from partiality and things like this, and commanded to provide justice to the fatherless. And so Roe versus Wade is literally the Supreme Court commanding magistrates to do what God has forbidden. That is to deny justice, to show impartiality, and to oppress the fatherless. And Roe versus Wade is also the civil government forbidding civil magistrates from doing what God commands, which is provide justice, promote, impartiality, and to defend the fatherless. And so Roe versus Wade is the Supreme Court commanding what God forbids and forbidding what God commands to civil magistrates. Yeah. So I think that's an important thing for us all to realize. Again, no matter where you are on Romans 13, I think where almost everyone agrees, that's where we should all agree that Roe versus Wade is wrongfully telling civil magistrates to violate the law of God.
Yeah, that's so good. And it's also good timing, because we were just kind of having that debate with Todd Friel on our episode 2 weeks ago. And so it's good timing. But yeah, it's a great point. Like, there's that concept that almost, I think, I would probably say all Orthodox believers would agree with the thing about God, about us obeying God instead of man, where man has told us not to do something which he commands, or forbidding us from doing something, or forbidding what's good from God commands, or commanding what God forbids. And so that doesn't stop just as individuals. That doesn't become not a rule as soon as you become elected to public office. That rule is true universally. It's in God's word, so it's true for all men at all times. It doesn't stop being true in a certain scenario, in a certain place, for a certain person. That's true. It's binding over us. It's binding over the magistrates. And so, yeah, like you said, the application, like Kevin Stitt and Greg Abbott and all the legislatures in Texas and Oklahoma, they are being told by the Supreme Court to allow mass murder, which clearly, which is allowing something that God clearly forbids. And so, yeah, that doesn't stop being true just because they've been elected to public office. So it's really good.
So let's talk about the state of this. It's been submitted. They've been poring over it and reading it. What's next for the brief, and what people can do to sort of like get the word out on it? What do you need? What does Foundation to Abolish Abortion need from people in regard to this brief?
Yeah, so as far as what's going to happen next, so coming up soon, the respondents, which is the abortion mill, and their attorneys will be submitting their brief, and they'll have their amici, who will submit theirs on their side, which will be interesting reading. But then from there, the court will set up for oral arguments, which will be probably October, November, December, somewhere in there. And then it'll probably be decided sometime next year between January and July, somewhere in there. Although the court could even push it another year, but probably not. They'll probably decide January through July. So we'll see what happens there. As far as, ways that people can support this, you can check us out at faa.life. And we have a little form there that if you've got a legislator in your state, or you think you do, and you want help with drafting a bill of legislation, of abolition for your state, if you don't already have one, please contact us. That's one of the big reasons we exist, is to draft those kind of bills. So please contact us. We'd love to help with that. I know there's lots of other organizations like you guys who will also be helping with that. And so, that's what we're here for. If you want to make a donation, we'd love that. It helps us do more of this sort of thing. We're trying to produce more videos as well. We produced one recently.
Yep, really
we
good.
To do more of that. And so if someone wants to support us in that way, we'd be super grateful.
Yeah.
But just getting the word out is the most important thing.
Yeah, and FAA is actually, it's a 501c3.
Correct. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization.
So folks that are, maybe coming to understand the difference between abolition and pro-life, and have historically at the end of the year made end of the year donations to Right to Life organizations or whatever, really need to know that they now have, because we're 501c4, we can't, we don't expect these big massive donations from people to get tax write-offs. But when people, instead of giving money to the U.S. government to do, nefarious things, look for organizations to really donate to, where that money can go to something that they actually care about. And for those folks, it's faa.life, donation button, 501c3. They can write it off on their taxes. Everything's legit and above board.
Right.
So we definitely, we always say, hey, support Free the States, but we like to make it make it very clear that there's definitely enough folks involved in this. There's enough money to go around. And so we want to always say, hey, yeah, for this episode, when you're watching, you like what Bradley's doing, he has 10 kids. And that for folks that have probably seen your lectures that you've done for AATX, for us, you've come down to Oklahoma to give lectures, all super high quality, and it would be great to see more of that material getting out. And it all costs money because you got to pay video editors and all that kind of stuff. So Free the States would ask people who regularly support our organization to also support FAA.life with a donation after watching this video.
Yep. So you guys go make sure you're supporting them, supporting AATX, and make sure you're also following them and AATX. I guess on Facebook, it's going to be Abolish Abortion Texas, and on YouTube also Abolish Abortion Texas. Lots of really good stuff on their YouTube channel, like the stuff on Footnote 54. Bradley's got a really good talk on that.
Yeah.
He's got a great talk that we just blasted everywhere as much as we could. I wrote 3 articles on it and 4 emails on it. A talk going through the whole history of the Supreme Court and just kind of how Republican nominee after nominee has let us down and all that. So some really, really high quality educational stuff. So make sure you follow them on Facebook and YouTube. Anywhere else they need to connect with you guys, Bradley?
Twitter, we're on there as well with Abolish Abortion Texas if people want to connect with us there.
Awesome. Very good. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Bradley. As always, great to talk to you. And yeah, everyone, please share this episode. Share the news of this brief because this is really awesome. This is we're about 11 years. I'm 3 years into it. But 11 years into this abolitionist movement, and we are now having our arguments put before the Supreme Court of the United States for the first time. Really, really cool thing. And so help get the word out about this. And so please share this episode. And unless there's any objections, we got to do the outro, right?
Yeah. So this has been the Liberator podcast. We're committed to being as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. We'll see you next week.